Now, very honor for us to welcome you all to the honorary sections of the Professor Dr. Verne from the University of the Philippines. He is very really good and excellent ethnomusicology in Southeast Asia. By the way, today he will talk about with the decolonizing the classical, the University of the Philippines College of Music, and the construction of a national art music imaginary. Please welcome Dr. Verne.
Thank you. Does this sound? Okay, thank you. First of all, my gratitude to the organizers, Achan, Kunying, Wangchan, and Achan Anotai, for giving me the honor of joining this wonderful event, and congratulations. It's turning out to be a real success. Excuse me. I'm representing two offices today, the UP College, or the University of the Philippines College of Music, Department of Musicology, and also the UP Center for Ethnomusicology. However, today I will talk to you about the UP College of Music, which this month is celebrating its 99th anniversary. So we're turning 100 next year, and this is some sort of a paean, at the same time, critical look at ourselves and what we have become and what we have produced. This paper aims to contribute to this present conversation. I'm going to read the paper, but as soon as I see you dozing off, then I'll probably ditch the paper and just freestyle my way. This paper aims to contribute to this present conversation by confronting the construct of the classical as a vestige of long periods of colonial subjugation. While the essay focuses on the Philippine experience, the issues brought up certainly resonate with the rest of Southeast Asia. 300 years of Spanish rule resulted into the transformation of the essential facets of the life of a people, from the mundane to the spiritual, producing a populace detached from its roots, ambivalent towards its own hybrid identity, and alienated from its neighbors in the region. In music, the introduction of European forms, from the Gregorian chant through the agency of the Roman Catholic friars in the late 1500s, to Italian and German opera, courtesy of global mercantilism in the 1800s, along, of course, with their accompanying physical implements and mechanisms of transmission, gave way to the wholesale adoption of an alien symbolic and expressive complex, disrupting age-old indigenous traditions, and for most, to the point of extinction. Whatever native forms that survived this onslaught mutated extensively or retreated into marginalized existence, only to be further subjected to a second wave offensive dealt by the American period, beginning at the turn of the 20th century and lasting officially until 1935. To speak of decolonizing, or perhaps decolonializing then, is to address the strategies employed by the subjugated as articulations of identity or deliberate feats of resistance, rather than viewing these as mere passive submission or blind conformity. I hope to illustrate how the rise of classical art music in the Philippines parallels evolving notions of nationalism among Filipino thinkers, from being subjects of the empire to post-colonial actors in a global stage. Finally, I aim to show how the formation of a national art music imaginary involves appropriation in two ways: the enshrinement of marginalized native objects of expression by dressing them up in the aesthetic standards and models borrowed from the colonizer. This essay grounds the reading of the classical on distinctive features of art music, such as the notion of refinement, its codification or systematization into theoretical constructs, the premium ascribed to notation, the notion of the grand work by genius creators, and the formation of a connoisseur audience. Through the paper, I will go through the timeline of the history of the Philippine Republic. But I will concentrate mainly on the Spanish colonial period, and we'll go to the American period. In his chapter entitled The Hispanization of Philippine Music, David Irving highlights the interweaving of Spain's political and religious agenda in colonizing the islands. The sword and the cross symbolize the two-pronged civilizing mission, where devotion to the Catholic faith was equated with loyalty to the Spanish crown. The imposition of the white man's religion not just involved the teaching of church doctrine, but also the transformation of the natives into their cultural image. Since music played a central role in the Catholic liturgy, the transmission of a new musical language was imperative. Soon after the founding of the new colony and naming it after King Philip II, the friars established schools devoted to the teaching of Gregorian chant to boys' choirs and to church instrumentalists. As early as the late 1500s, the Spanish chronicler Morga wrote glowing accounts of the missionaries' activities with regard to the teaching of music. Let me read to you. They run schools in which boys learn how to read and write in Spanish, teaching them how to serve in church, how to sing plain chant and polyphony, and how to play instruments. They also teach them to dance, sing, and play harps, guitars, and other instruments, in which there is already great skill, especially around Manila. Where there are very good capillas, there are chapels of indigenous singers and instrumentalists, and so on. This is from Morga, written in the late 1500s, but published in 1609 as a report to the Spanish crown. I don't have, of course, understandably, an example of the music at the time of young boys singing Gregorian chant. The closest I can come to is this piece written by an anonymous Filipino composer sometime in the 1800s. And by the 1800s, they were already competent in writing the Latin Mass. This is the Sanctus of a piece called the Missa Baclayana. This piece was found and restored by a musicologist about 5 or so years ago and published, which is fine because a couple of years, last year or 2 years ago, the church was totally destroyed by an earthquake in the island. The transplanted musical language of the colonizers, however, would not only take root and flourish within the confines of the Catholic Church, it would soon be assimilated into the secular world as well. With the fortification of Spanish political and church structure, the musical sounds, structures, and material properties of the conquistadores would be absorbed almost wholesale. Its imagery and sentiment would be idealized and replicated by local musicians. By the 1800s, a thriving musical life revolved around civic and ecclesiastical observances throughout the year. As a result of this cultural imposition, pre-European contact music and dance expressions are left with two probable courses of action other than to be completely obliterated. One is to assimilate, and the other is to evacuate. To illustrate, let me present two cases, that of the Kulintang and the Kundiman. And I will follow the story of the Kulintang and the Kundiman throughout the history of the Philippines and their transformation. Taking two separate tracks throughout the course of history, these two folk traditions will eventually end up in the academe, albeit at separate points in time and under contrasting circumstances. Here, and particularly I'm talking about the University of the Philippines, their transformation will continue as both, in due course, are subsumed and inscribed into the national art repertory. Kulintang refers to the horizontal gong row comprised of tuned kettles found in the southern Philippines as well as in Borneo, Sumatra, and Sulawesi. In the Philippines, Kulintang is associated with Muslim populations in Mindanao, although the tradition predates the coming of Islam into the islands. The music continued to flourish in the Islamic minority communities in southern Philippines, but has vanished in the Christianized majority of the country with the coming of Spain in the 16th century. As the tradition is practiced in Mindanao, Kulintang music is associated with prestigious celebrations such as weddings and circumcision rites, as well as for daily entertainment and leisure. Kulintang performers gain prestige in the community by engaging in competitions held in these public celebrations, where the best musicians are named for their skill in various playing techniques, as well as stamina. The playing goes on the entire night and they compete against each other, and you need stamina for that. Apart from these secular contexts, Kulintang music is employed in non-Islamic healing rituals that involve trance. One of the earliest documentations on Kulintang comes from a Spanish chronicler, where he describes the music as part of daily entertainment, along with card games, fighting bouts, war dances, and sensual dances by ladies. It details an instrument comprised of 10 small gongs. This is from Montero y Vidal, 1888. Again, of course, I don't have a video for you from that time. However, I'd like to show a film made by Robert Garfield from the 1960s. This is from the Maguindanao people of Mindanao. Like I said, this is filmed in the 1960s. It probably brings us closer to the authentic context of Kulintang music. I will contrast this later when it comes back to the University of the Philippines and the new context. Of course, when I say authentic, they probably are aware that they are being filmed, and so there's a bit of stiffness as far as the audience is concerned, and I would suspect it would be more casual in a normal setting. Perhaps because of its inherent incompatibility with the civilizing mission of the conquistadores, as probably we may have gleaned in the description, sensual dances, trances. Of course, the friars would not have anything to do with this stuff. The Kulintang tradition eventually vanished in the areas occupied by the Hispanized majority. However, it will continue among the language groups least impacted by the Spanish colonization, only to be quote-unquote rediscovered by the academics in the 20th century. Let me go to the other item here, the kundiman. So kulintang migrates. Kundiman assimilates. The kundiman, a lyrical song popular among the Tagalog speakers, came to be widely mentioned by the Spanish writers around the 1800s. A lot of Spanish writers would describe the popularity of the kundiman around the time. Although its roots are most likely from pre-European contact forms called awit and kumintang. As it is known today, the kundiman is sung to the accompaniment of a guitar or a piano playing Western harmonic progressions in minor key set to moderate triple time. In short, it has absorbed a lot of Western elements already. The text almost invariably speaks of love, commonly the amorous, unrequited type, but there are, later on, I will show, the love of country will also come into the text. Said to have been a contraction of the phrase kung hindi man, or if it were not so, which is the common formulation of the lyrics, the kundiman was associated with countryside bachelors, as you see on the right side of the screen, serenading their beloved. Other historical sources give a clue to the performance in another context of the kundiman in the 1800s. This painting on the left side, is from the Biblioteca Nacional de España, and it's entitled El Condiman. And here we find a couple dancing to the music performed by a small ensemble of musicians. And you see westernized instruments there. And if you look closely, the man and the woman, I think, playing castanets as they dance. If this piece of artwork is considered as a documentation of performance context, then it is highly probable that kundiman is akin to numerous couple dances that are found all over Southeast Asia. Lam Sing in Thailand comes to mind. Subsequently, the element of dance in the kundiman will disappear, and the emphasis will be placed on composed works performed by a solo vocalist as the tradition continues to adapt to shifting cultural mores and preferences. Today, you will not see anybody, it would be unthinkable to dance the kundiman. It will take on varied forms of the revolutionary, the popular, and the art song as it enters the classical world later. Again, what I have here is a piece from fieldwork. The public closely resembles the kundiman of 1800s. In minor key, in triple time. So, not all kundiman, but this is the most popular type, the one that begins in, all of them are in minor and in triple. But the most popular type is like this, begins with minor and modulates to a parallel measure. And we will see later this will become the model for the composers of the University of the Philippines. The entrenchment of Hispanized and Europeanized sacred and secular music practices was further secured with the rise of global mercantilism as the port city of Manila became an international hub. The galleon trade that connected the east and west through Manila and Acapulco began in 1655 and lasted until about 1815 and was instrumental for the exchange of goods, the rising economy, and extensive cultural exchange. If I show you the routes that they take, the white lines are the Spanish routes. So it goes through Acapulco, goes over to Manila. The blue lines are the competing route of the Portuguese. And so the Spanish had won over the Portuguese in this sense. So in this global, in this galleon trade, you would find music also being involved. For instance, musical instruments, scores, and even performers were transported from Europe to the islands to feed a rising demand among locals. Even after the termination of the galleon trade, global engagement was sustained such that by the 19th century, musical theater productions of Spanish zarzuelas and European operas were exported to the islands. You're able to export these productions mainly because, one, you have an audience for it, so you can sell tickets. Number two, you have opera houses already in Manila by the time. But number three, you have orchestras of Filipino musicians in Manila, because you cannot afford to bring the entire orchestra from Europe or Spain into Manila. And so you have a ready set of musicians already to be hired in Manila. Furthermore, they became models for Filipino composers to emulate, resulting into native versions, such as the Tagalog zarzuela, which is modeled after the Spanish zarzuela. And during that time, the critics hailed it as the modern alternative, the new wave, to replace the outmoded comedia. That's a more ancient form of theater, music theater. Thus, the colonialists employed music to subdue its subjects in the hope of instilling loyalty to imperial Spain and the Mother Church. Resistance, however, by the natives against the Inquisition began as early as the 16th century in the form of, sad to say, failed pocket rebellions. However, by the 19th century, fueled in part by the work of Filipino intellectuals educated in Europe, and inspired by an awareness of political movements abroad, they looked to the revolution in France and made a model of that. These separate revolts coalesced into a national revolution for sovereignty, spearheaded by a group called the Kataas-Taasang Kagalang-Galangang Katipunan, or KKK, the Revolutionary Filipino Army. For the revolutionary, the imposed or adopted musical tongue, the Western music, became a part of the armory. They discovered music, this music that they adopted could be a weapon. Insurgent groups composed anthems, marches, played by bamboo marching bands called musikong bongbong. What is the difference between these and a brass band? Nothing, except that they switch from brass to bamboo to stress that this is our identity. We are not Europeans, but the music, of course, is basically the same. It's an indigenization of the European brass band, and the intention is to emphasize emerging Filipino identity. The Tagalog zarzuela I mentioned earlier became a mouthpiece for revolutionary propaganda and would eventually be banned by Spanish and later American authorities because it has become seditious. The Kundiman, on the other hand, the lyrical text will be amended so that now it will encode, rather than love for somebody, it will be encoding love for country, while retaining that tender air. Doing so inspired lots of listeners towards patriotism and valor. The style evolved around the 1800s and came to be known as the revolutionary kundiman. And the most famous of the revolutionary kundiman is one that is called Joselinang Baliwag, or Jocelyn of Baliwag Town. Again, this is an arrangement for choir and a small orchestra. So in the past, it was probably a solo singer and a guitar. You see that melancholic sound, beautiful melody. You would hardly know it's revolutionary. Parallel major. And so on. Now let's go to the American era. Just at the point when the Filipino revolutionaries were almost winning the war against Spain, what was thought to be impossible before was now possible around the late 19th century because Spanish was fighting a war in many fronts, and that weakened them, particularly the Spanish-American War. So just as at the brink, when the Filipinos thought they were winning the war, the Philippines was sold by Spain to a new master, the United States. In the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1896, Spain agreed to cede the Philippines to the US for $20 million, marking the end of the Spanish-American War. The agreement gained strong support from American citizens and legislators because of the potential economic gain from the new colony. Of course, they had more morally based reasons for coming over. You know, again, the white man's burden to uplift the downtrodden. But this is President William McKinley speaking in 1898. Incidental to our tenure in the Philippines is the commercial opportunity to which American statesmanship cannot be indifferent. It is just to use every legitimate means for the enlargement of American trade. Now, the Americans had quite of a situation here. They were coming over facing a people, the Filipino people, wary of centuries of servitude and with a rising and an intensifying consciousness of national sovereignty. How do you deal with that? So the American government's seduction of the hearts and minds of the Filipino people commenced with a policy that they called the benevolent assimilation. Here, the promise of a total national independence became the proverbial carrot on a stick waved in front of the Filipinos. We will grant you total independence, but you have to prove to us that you're ready to govern yourself. So we will have to educate you and help you develop. Uncle Sam played the role of a dedicated mentor to the hapless child. Education then became the key to uplifting the citizenry towards free participation among the so-called advanced human civilizations. Here, public schools like this were established all over the country as the state took over what was once the sole responsibility of the Catholic Church in the Spanish period. Music continued to be part of the transformation agenda. And here you see school children receiving instruction in singing folk songs and in basic music theory. This is a first grade modern music primer from early 20th century in Manila. But they did not stop at the primary and the secondary level. In 1908, the University of the Philippines was established by the Philippine Commission as the state university. Modeled after American universities, UP was tasked with providing, quote, advanced instruction in literature, philosophy, the sciences, and arts, and to give professional and technical training to every qualified student, regardless of age, sex, nationality, religious belief, and political affiliation. That was from the Philippine Assembly Act number 1870. And then 8 years after the founding of the university, the UP Conservatory of Music was founded. It was first named the Conservatory. By the 1960s, it will switch to the name College of Music. It had, when it was founded, the goal of training aspiring musicians in performance, composition, conducting, and music education. Now, the access to higher learning in music within an intellectual environment that was the premier university was in fact an open invitation to Filipino musicians. You have to understand that these Filipino musicians had such poor self-worth, which was molded and internalized through years and years of servitude, generations of servitude. And this was their chance to elevate their talent and craft to a level at par with the idealized, in parentheses, Western standards. Thus, as you see here, the first three directors appointed to lead the conservatory were all whites. Wallace George and Robert Schofield were Americans, and the third one was Austrian, Alexander Lipay, to make the transfer of European music more authentic. More importantly, the conservatory provided the American regime a means to domesticate and reconfigure the wild nationalist flame still burning among seditious Filipino composers and dramatists of the sovereignty movement. Hence, the foundation was laid for the forging of a national, parenthesis, classical music imaginary. You have to remember, around this time, you also have successful, popular nationalist movements already ongoing in Europe from the time of the late 19th century going on until the 20th century to Bartók and Kodály, but even before that with Liszt and Grieg and so on. And that became a model for Filipino composers. In fact, it's the American and the Austrian mentors who encouraged the composers to, why not take something Filipino and transform that to be part of the national repertory, a national music, a nationalist movement in music. And so comes back the Kundiman, what we call the golden age of the Kundiman, sometime around 1920s, some people say up to 1930s or to 1940s. Those 20 or so years were very active in turning out all these pieces of refined Kundiman. Let me show you two examples from one composer who is very important. His name is Nicanor Abelardo. And he was born in 1893 and passed away in 1934. He's so important that our school's building is named after him. Our school's building is the Nicanor Abelardo Hall. Now, to exemplify the period where the traditional Kundiman was refined using Western Romantic music idiom and following the example of nationalist music movements in Europe, I will show you two examples. This is Kundiman, this is Nasaan Ka Iro, composed in 1923. You have an excerpt there of the piano and tenor. However, I just realized that the piece or the example I'm going to use somehow omitted the piano introduction, but it works as well. You have the tenor coming in right away without any introduction. I have a simple harmony reduction on the screen that you might want to follow. Now he has a contrasting section B. Notice the harmonic sophistication. Short interlude. And then C goes to the parallel major. Then the whole thing is, I mean, the section C is repeated with variation now. And then the coda. We don't have time to go into the detail, but fantastic tone painting here, the way he set the text to music. Let me just let you hear very quickly another piece from Nicanor Abelardo. This is Kundiman ng Luha. Again, here's a reduction. This is from Dr. Ramon Santos's analysis. And so the transformation of the Kundiman from the guitar singer in the field now to here. That sounds like a leader or probably an aria. And Nicanor Abelardo will not be alone in writing this. There are many more composers that follow him. Of course, in serious art music, well, vocal music is good, but you know what is better is instrumental forms. And so these composers would go on to compose quartets and symphonies and so on. Meanwhile, back to the University of the Philippines, in 1950s, the then president, his name is Jorge Bocobo, continuing this new consciousness about nationalism and looking at your own identity, he decided to send out researchers into the field to collect music from the countryside. In order, one is to produce books for young people and syllabi for grade school PE dance programs. And they came up with a lot of materials, and here comes back the kulintang. And the data they found became the material for reconfiguring this native musics into more exotic type, essentialized forms that became big hits abroad. They were sent out, the Bayanihan dancers. And you can probably tell the stage performance now. So this troupe in the early 1960s was sent out, I think it was to Germany, and it became a big hit there, then traveled America and became a model for a lot of other Filipiniana, we call it, folkloric troupes in the Philippines. And I should say, you find a lot of this in Southeast Asia today as well. So the native that once, the kulintang, and that music that once migrated out to escape colonialism is back in its essentialized, exoticized form. Now in 1963, Jose Maceda, who is an ethnomusicologist and a composer, and before that a concert pianist, and the first to systematize the survey of Philippine music, established what was then called the Department of Asian Music at the College of Music. Subsequently, the Department of Asian Music will be called the Department of Music Research, and today, the Department of Musicology, of which I chair. Now, what he did was he embarked on a pioneering systematic survey of music in the Philippines in the 1950s, and he wrote his dissertation on the Maguindanao kulintang. But like ethnomusicologists during the time, the idea was to bring into your schools people from the field who are practitioners to teach your own students. The concept was then, as propagated by Mandelhood, by musicality, teaching your conservatory students majoring in piano or whatever Western music to be also competent in another form of Asian music. But what is important here is the kind of nationalism, or not the nationalism at all, that Maceda proposes here. To him, nation state doesn't matter. What matters to him is the Filipino being in Asia. He already saw the Philippines, number one, as being corrupted by all of this colonial imposition. So the only way to discover or rediscover yourself is to look into the fringes, out in the field, bringing in the masters, and looking at the neighbors in Asia. So now you have a new idea of what nationalism is. It's a post-colonial, anti-hegemonic, counter-hegemonic form. And he brings in, by the way, he begins composing, and you see kulintang being used here. I don't have time now to talk about that. But he brings in a master. Her name is Agamayo Butocan, who was a performer in kulintang in Maguindanao to teach piano majors, violin majors kulintang. Agamayo had a problem in the beginning. How do you translate oral tradition in her village to teach music majors? And she had a hard time looking for the answer. Then finally, she came up with the solution and developed her own transcription, what you see above. Kind of like the TUBS, the time unit box systems, which, by the way, also developed around that time, the 1960s, but specifically for West African drumming. This one, of course, it would be interesting to do research on how the TUBS influenced Agamayo. But she subsequently published a book called Palabuni-Bunyan, and the book became like the textbook for all Filipino musicians studying kulintang. And kulintang was taught like the way you would teach piano. You have 30 minutes to 1 hour a week. You have a graded levels. You have repertoire, and you have examinations and a recital at the end. So you have people now majoring in kulintang. And let me just show you our own students and the way they perform kulintang music now, contrasted with the earlier excerpt that I showed you. This is a graduation recital of a kulintang major. Actually, an Asian music major whose instrument is the kulintang. This is where I argue that now kulintang is in a different realm. It's in a separate world, a darkened room, played by people in formal costumes, with a proper audience who knows when to clap at the proper time and so on. Just like listening to any other Western art music. So here we have two things taken from the world outside. Artifacts, the kondiman, the kulintang, being reformed and reformulated to become part of the art world. What happens here now is actually, you can consider as double appropriation. The academic, the composer, or whatever you call it, appropriates an artifact from the native other, those from the countryside, those from the indigenous people, and brings it in and aestheticizes that, dresses it up with the standards of the hegemony of the Western colonial masters. And you have national art. That's the equation. Lastly, I want to show you the evolving notions of nationalism compared in parallel motion to the development of national art music. So in the beginning, you have no idea of nation, of course. Nation started here with the coming of Spain, And then at the beginning, there were just subjects loyal to the cross and the crown. And then you have this rising consciousness of national sovereignty. Then reified identity in the coming of the Americans. And finally, to the time of Maceda, from now, a post-colonial anti-hegemonic movement looking at the neighbors. And it goes on until today. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for the very interesting presentation. I have a question. Could you go back to the second last slide? Because I didn't understand that. Can you elaborate? Thank you.
So, in the formation of the art imaginary, the art music, national art music, how do you do that? Maintaining identity of Filipino-ness, and yet in the standards of global, Western music. So you take something that is essentialized as Filipino, kulintang, from the countryside, but that's not part of your music because you're from the city, right? You take that something in, you dress that up with applying standards of Western music or Western art. The idea of the author, the idea of it being written down, the idea of being enshrined and canonized, then it becomes part of the national art opus.
What is
Corpus.
the
Corpus.
hegemony here?
Oh, it's Western hegemony against colonized people. You see, it's always, for people like us, we cannot escape that whole experience. It's always us about what do we do, being hybrid products of years and years and centuries of colonialism. So we see that as a hegemony that is we're struggling against all the time.
Thank you for your good presentation. As I heard, the jarana was the most famous among the Filipinos during the Spanish colonization, but you didn't say something about the jarana, or it disappeared during the Spanish collapse. Or I would like you to talk about the jarana something, please.
The jarana is not a musical style, but a context. The jarana means to serenade. So the practice of serenading, jarana, of course, was done by singing. Today, of course, in the modern world, you don't really have that anymore. But probably still in the countryside, people still go to the window and sing to the loved one, serenading. Jarana is basically serenading. And you can sing whatever type of music you want to sing. You can sing a kundiman mostly during the time. Today, you can bring a karaoke machine and sing.
That means it's become the history. Right now, I can say the jarana becomes the histories of the Philippines, right? It disappeared, right?
Well, it's transformed. People still do jarana nowadays in different contexts.
Okay.
Right?
Okay, in different
You don't have windows anymore like that, right? But you come in with a karaoke machine and sing to each other,
okay.
right? You can say that's jarana now. But of course, the traditional one, you will not find, probably very hard to find those anymore.
Thank you.
Hello. Do you see, again on this slide, do you see this as a form of colonialism continuing, or do you see this as globalization? Because earlier we talked about education, and then I was sharing with detail how a lot of times our folk music is taught back to us in this westernized form, simply because you mentioned the pedagogies, the assessment, the curricular design involved requires all these standards and all that. And so it's always very easy to kind of map it across that way, right? When you are teaching topic in an institution that is in its setup a westernized construct, right?
Yeah.
So
that's the quandary there. You like to infuse your curriculum with traditional forms, but how do you do it? Because you are fixed in that colonial structure in the first place, right? The university. And they divide it into hours, into courses, and so on. You get a grade. That's not oral tradition. That's the problem there. And I'm just stating the situation. By bringing in Kulintang, as the idea is being anti-hegemonic, right? Countering up the colonial ideas of Kundiman and all that. But in the same light, you're allowing Kulintang to be absorbed by the very system that you're fighting against in the first place. And this is an indictment to us.
I know. I guess that's why I'm asking. Like, do you have your own personal strategies, or do you see any strategies?
I tell you about the strategy of Madame Agamayo Butokan, who has taught students to read for so many years, but they decided this is not the way to do it. So what she did was she somehow allowed the classroom to be more flexible. She allowed other students to come in and to play along if they wished. They allowed her to go around and talk and so on. And at a certain point, she made them drop all the scores, did not make them read anymore, but instead allowed them to play and improvise. The traditional, closest to the traditional way she learned Kulintang herself. Those are the coping mechanisms of teachers.
The last question, anyone? Okay.
If I may. Pretty much the last two pieces, the vocal pieces, sound, like you said, sounds like Germany or sounds like, how do you deal with that? I mean, it's not Filipino, although the fact he might...
It's hybrid. There's still Filipino about it. The text is Filipino. The sentiment. Here's the point. Tomaseda, in his time, in the 60s, at his point, this is not Filipino. This is colonial crap. Excuse the word. Right? He will do that. He will look at all the indigenous things. But to us, after him, to our generation, we cannot deny anymore our colonial past. That's part of our story. That's part of who we are, right? We're beyond the questioning of what's Filipino about this. Probably it's more German or Italian than it is Filipino. It's part of our heritage, and that's there. So we cannot get away from it.
Yeah, because even the vocal style.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly.
Oh, perhaps, I mean, in creativity, in terms of, are you, well, I should ask, are there new...
Well, nobody writes Kundiman anymore, if that's what you're asking. This comes from that period of the nationalist movement, 1920s, 1930s. But we still enshrine it, as the canon of Filipino art, music, the highest point. See, many people view it as the refinement of Kulintang into its highest realm. That's questionable, of course.
So today, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Wan from the University of the Philippines. Next, we have the breakout section after this. Thank you.